Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Sunday, which used to be bleak and barren on this channel. I used to complain on Sundays because there's no mail, so I don't get any free books in the front door. But now, Sundays are wonderful times. Now, Sundays are when we do our read-alongs, which we are always going to do on this channel with the sole exception of December. And this time around, we're reading Sherlock Holmes for SherlockTober, where we had been reading a couple of the novels of Sherlock Holmes, and then it just seemed like the perfect idea to just keep going. This is great stuff, and it's so foundational to so much of the genre, and it's been quoted and adapted. It's such a part of our culture that why not take a volume down and read these stories, especially if you've never done it before. So this time around, for the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, we picked 6 stories: A Scandal in Bohemia, The Red-Headed League, The Man with the Twisted Lip, The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, The Adventure of the Speckled Band, and The Adventure of the Copper Beeches. And I chose those not only because they are tremendously dramatic, I think, just dramatically effective, and also somewhat different, but also for a lot of other reasons. These stories are when we start to see Doyle really perfect this odd thing that he had created, and perfect a lot of the little gestures that go into making it so irresistible to its readers. I mentioned last time, one of those little gestures is to include the reader in the process of making it irresistible. We are told in one of our stories here that Watson has continued to chronicle the story of Sherlock Holmes in stories that are the stories that we have read. The characters are aware of the stories that we are reading. That's extremely innovative, more so than it looks on the surface, especially since it's been copied so many times. But there's a point in one of these 6 stories where Holmes has to ride off into danger, and Watson says, "Well, I'll come along if you think I can be useful." And Holmes says, "A trusted companion is always useful in a tight spot, but also one wants a chronicler." So the problem that Holmes had with having Watson tell his adventures, although it might stick around in the surface, at one point in one of these stories that we're reading today, Holmes again criticizes Watson for the sensational nature of the stories, but it's obvious that he's made his peace with them happening and seems to like it. And I love that at that moment when Holmes criticizes the stories, Watson is touchy. In the rare instances, it happens like 3 times in the whole of the core canon, that where Holmes criticizes Watson's art as a writer, Watson gets touchy. That's good. That's very human. And it's at those times when Holmes does that Watson's immediate response is always that his companion is extremely vain, is extremely arrogant. But one way or another, one of the things that I wanted to emphasize about these stories is the variety that Doyle started coming up with. He started coming up with stories that you just can't predict. The amateur detective subgenre was in its infancy when he was writing these things. So I guess on one level you could say that he didn't really know to be derivative, but at another level, he clearly he's having a ball, is what I'm trying to say. He clearly wants to please you, the reader. So we get a huge variety of things here that have since gone into the canon. They have since become just archetypal in terms of murder mystery stories. And I picked these 6 largely for their variety, but also for a few other reasons. Because I think one of Doyle's great achievements with Holmes and Watson is to take them outside of the carefully structured Victorian social hierarchy. Watson is an invalided doctor from the front lines in Afghanistan. But what is Holmes? We don't know anything about him. We know that he has to earn money to pay for digs, but he doesn't seem to have a job. Other than that, he has fees as the world's only amateur consulting detective, but as he says, they're extremely reasonable, except in those cases where he waives them altogether. So he doesn't come from money that we know of, and appears not to have any aspirations of that kind. He is an anomalous character in terms of Victorian literature, because he's not a vagabond, despite how much he associates with them. But he's not a toff either, the kind of being that will later become known as a toff. And the stories that we picked this time around show him at all the different levels of society. In Scandal in Bohemia, he is the client of a king. He has a client who is a king, the king of Bohemia. And treats the King of Bohemia with no deference whatsoever. This is the story that introduces the infamous Irene Adler, the woman in the Holmes mythology, a woman who is, the king is desirous of getting back the tokens of his affection for her because they could ruin him in the public sphere when he makes a proper marriage to further he doesn't want the world to know that he had a dalliance with this woman, with this Irene Adler, who is not, as he puts it, on his level. And at the end of the story, when Holmes has, through not much fault of his own, the story really belongs to Irene Adler. But when the problem works out to the king's satisfaction, he offers Holmes anything. I will be extremely generous. You have solved a major problem for me. Offers him, for instance, an ornate emerald ring from his finger. And Holmes says, what I would like instead is her picture, her photograph, which the king gladly gives. But when they are reading the letter that Irene Adler sends, a great triumphant letter in which it becomes obvious that she has known all along how to handle these guys who are after her, not just the king, but Sherlock Holmes, the famous Sherlock Holmes. When they read her letter, the king is awestruck and repeats to Holmes and Watson, didn't I say, isn't she amazing? Didn't I say what a queen she would make if only she were on my level? And Holmes infamously says, well, yes, from what I know of this woman, she's definitely on a different level than you are. There's no noblesse oblige at all. And the same thing, we work our way straight through. Probably the other end of the spectrum is The Man with the Twisted Lip, which has a great atmospheric, provoking incident where a fine, well-to-do wife is wandering through a horrible slum alley of London, an alley notorious for its home for opium dens, when she looks up and sees from an upper window her husband looking straight at her. And he's astonished. He yells out and pulls his head back in the window. And when she, of course, tries to get into the opium den to find out what's going on, the horrible, brutish guard at the door won't let her in. It's the start of a great adventure that has, as you know, if you've read these stories, it has as its conclusion that her husband, in order to first make square on an emergency bill for which he had no money, he's just a weekly wagerer, decided to rough up his appearance and beg on the streets of London on an assumed identity, quoting patches of Shakespeare and whatnot, and was so entertaining to his clients that he soon started bringing in a large amount of money, larger than a gentleman makes, with that as his job. and the two worlds connect when his wife accidentally sees him, and the whole thing starts to come crumbling down. I don't think that The Man with the Twisted Lip, you'll have to tell me what you think, but I don't think The Man with the Twisted Lip really resolves a lot of the issues that it raises. But we also get, in these stories, in terms of social ladder, we get a horrible, evil, funhouse mirror reverse image of Dr. Watson. We get an evil doctor, Grimsby Roylott. We get a man who, as Holmes puts it, when a doctor turns to evil, he's the worst. And we get a horrifying mystery. The mystery of the speckled band still has the power to raise goosebumps on your flesh. There's a moment in that story when Holmes is asking questions of a young woman who has been disturbed in her sleep at night. And it's obvious that Holmes, as usual in so many of these scenes, Holmes has points to his questions. He knows something that he hasn't told anybody. And he's asking questions to confirm and to narrow the field. And everybody's watching him do that. And Watson at one point says, I begin dimly to see what it is that you're getting at. And if it's true, it's something subtle and horrible. And it is. The resolution of the speckled band is subtle and horrible. It will rob you of your sleep for at least a night. And I think it's amazing that a 100-year-old story can still do that. And there's the Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, which also ranges from extreme wealth and cursed wealth all the way down to the lowest levels, to the lowest levels, to a hapless thief who fears at the end of the story that he's completely ruined his life, all for the sake of a gem, the blue carbuncle, which he's never even seen, has never had a chance even to possess. And the ways of that, the way that Doyle keeps that ball in the air is just virtuoso. You can read these stories over and over again. They just hold up. It's amazing. And there's also the Red-Headed League. Now, when you pull apart the actual line-by-line plot schematic of The Adventure of the Red-Headed League, I think it holds up less well than a lot. It's clearly Doyle going for the picaresque absurd. And because he does that so well, it sticks in your mind. It's an immortal Holmes story because of that. But I think that if you were to break it down, as plenty of fans have done, if you were to break it down line by line in terms of logic, I don't think it quite holds up very well. And yet, The Adventure of the Red-Headed League has one of my favorite passages. I've read it before on this channel. I want to indulge you and read it again. Where, for the moment, Holmes and Watson, in investigating the mystery of the Red-Headed League, are stymied and at a slight natural break in their investigation. They decide to go to Violin Land. They decide to go and listen to a concert. And we get this passage. This is, of course, Watson narrating. My friend was an enthusiastic musician, being himself not only a very capable performer, but a composer of no ordinary merit. All the afternoon he sat in the stalls, wrapped in the most perfect happiness, gently waving his long, thin fingers in time to the music, while his gently smiling face and his languid, dreamy eyes were as unlike those of Holmes the sleuth-hound, Holmes the relentless, keen-witted, ready-handed criminal agent, as it was possible to conceive. In his singular character, the dual nature alternately asserted itself, and his extreme exactness and astuteness represented, as I have often thought, the reaction against the poetic and contemplative mood which occasionally predominated in him. The swing of his nature took him from extreme languor to devouring energy, and as I knew well, he was never so truly formidable as when, for days on end, he had been lounging in his armchair amid the improvisations and his black-letter editions. Then it was that the lust of the chase would suddenly come upon him, and that his brilliant reasoning power would rise to the level of intuition until those who were unacquainted with his methods would look askance at him as on one who knows, as a man whose knowledge is not as other mortals. And keep in mind, Watson knows what he's talking about, because he's often in that position himself. When I saw him that afternoon, so enwrapped in the music at St. James Hall, I felt that an evil time might be coming for those whom he had set himself to hunt down. And that's a note that is struck in these early stories. It's not struck very hard. You have to look for it, but I love it because it's there. If you look for it, you'll find it. Is that despite the fact that Holmes and Watson are becoming better and better acquainted with each other, Watson is still a little afraid of this guy. He's not quite sure. Passages like that, where if you didn't know better, you would swear that Holmes's knowledge was not as other mortal men. Passages like that are designed to indicate that Watson knows that Holmes is normal, that he's extremely observant, but there's nothing supernatural about him. But the reason, it's always struck me that the persistence of little lines like that leads me to think that maybe Watson was never quite sure. But one way or another, I chose these 6 stories to show, among other things, I think they're dramatically wonderful. But I chose them in part to show Holmes operating on all levels of society. He is a loose cannon on the deck of the good ship Victoria in England. We don't know. He seems at home everywhere. He seems comfortable and comfortably superior to every class of person that he meets. And he blends in, keep in mind, right? I mean, he recognizes, for instance, the King of Bohemia, even in disguise, and has at his fingertips the king's matrimonial arrangements, as tangled as they are. But also, at the other end of the spectrum, when Watson is looking for the man with the twisted lip on behalf of his wife in a opium den, he meets Holmes in disguise in that opium den. So you never quite know, and I love that. I absolutely love that. And that continues in the 6 stories that we're doing next. I wanted to refresh your memory, those of you who are reading along at home. The next volume is the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. And we are doing The Adventure of Silverblaze, The Adventure of the Cardboard Box, The Adventure of the Crooked Man, The Adventure of the Greek Interpreter, The Adventure of the Naval Treaty, and, of course, The Adventure of the Final Problem. So we'll meet back here next Sunday and talk about those 6 stories. These 2 volumes, The Adventures of the Memoirs, are immortal. They barely have a bad note. We will get to the other stories in SherlockTober next year. But in the meantime, of course, I want to know everything. I want to know everything that you're thinking. Did you like these stories more than the novels? Do you think, as so many people have, that the short story is Doyle's natural genre and that the novels are a little bit pumped up? We're going to have to come to terms with that one way or another, because we're going to be reading a novel in October. But what did you think of? Here you're getting a blast of short stories after having read novels. What did you think? Is the whole setup, the whole design of the Holmes Watson type story, is it better suited to short stories in your opinion? And what about the outlandish plots, the outlandish plot devices? Did you smile? Did you go right along? Or did you say, oh, come on? I want to know it all, especially from those of you who are reading these for the first time. So that is SherlockTober. That is week 1 of SherlockTober. We will meet again next week for another read-along. We'll do 6 more Sherlock Holmes stories and have a blast. So I'll wrap this up for now, but I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.